The movie starts with a backhoe loader going through a cold and gloomy-looking suburban town filled with old houses and streets with narrow, one-lane roads. It keeps going and taking turns for quite some time. We see Peter crossing a lake with a small ferry boat in the next scene. He hears screaming when they get closer to the shore and sees an ambulance, paramedics, and a woman in the lake. She screams while a paramedic tries to get her out of the water. They make eye contact, and the ferry arrives to the shore. Peter gets back to his car, drives to a mine, and meets with a man, Steve, who will be his father-in-law soon. They talk about the road, and Steve tells him Peter will be the head of the barn now, and Ronaldo, his youngest soon-to-be brother-in-law, will help him. Steve talks with Peter about how fast everything is happening, and he doesn't think talking a few times on Skype will be enough to know him, but he hopes Zoe knows what she's doing, and all he can do is wish him well. We see Peter going to the land Zoe's grandfather inherited to her. He looks around a bit and sees Ronaldo driving a loader coming towards him. He tells him to stop, and he'll handle from now on, but Ronaldo keeps driving towards him. He then gets out, gives Peter the keys to the house and barn, then leaves, barely looking at his face. Peter takes the wheel and starts to carry the branches in the yard when Zoe and his older brother, Joe, comes to check on him. He gets out and starts to tell them about his plans of the house, barn, and yard, and Zoe suggests renovating the house. They mention how he came to live in there because Zoe loves this place. They leave, and we see Peter continuing to work in the yard. He puts down some branches and doesn't really pay attention while going back with the loader. This causes him to hit a tree and uproot it. He gets out to check and sees human bones. He gets scared and calls Zoe, but she doesn't answer. He drives to talk to her, but sees her partying and decides to not tell her anything, so he goes back to the house. He covers the skeleton. Then, he goes inside the house and starts looking around. Zoe calls him and asks him why he called. He says it's nothing important and hears a voice. He goes out to investigate it in the pouring rain. He walks towards to the area where he found the skeleton. He sees a woman dressed in white and gets sucked into the mud. He fights to get back out, but gets pulled back again. The next morning, we see Joe and Ronaldo, his brothers-in-law, come and look for him because it's their wedding day. They don't see him at the house, so they go out looking for him and find Peter sleeping in his car. They wake him up and tell him to get dressed. Peter notices mud and dirt in his hands, nose, and ears, and he goes to wash them. Joe makes a speech to him and mentions how the old Peter is dead from now on without knowing what happened the last night. We see Peter and Zoe getting married in the church. They say their vows and leave the church to go to the barn to celebrate. While in the car, Peter makes eye contact with a woman dressed in all black. This is the woman he saw on the shore. They arrive at the barn and start celebrating with dancing and singing. Zoe tells Peter to tilt his head back and rushes him to the house. We see Peter's nose bleeding. He tells her it's okay and they get intimate. Peter hears a sound and rushes outside to see Joe and Ronaldo with the loader about to dig the ground where he found the skeleton. He tells them to stop and gets a little angry with them. Zoe gets out and he yells at her to go back. Joe asks him what happened and tells him he seems different. Peter jokes with him and they go back to the wedding party. They sit at the tables, and a man named Simon, they call him the professor, makes a speech. He talks about Zoe's grandfather and mentions a quote. He says that people who are unable to live in society are either God or beast, but no one seems to listen to him. They get him off the stage, and Peter notices his ring is missing. He tells Zoe he lost his ring, and he goes to look for it. He finds kids who play inside the house, and they scare him a little. He gets out of the house, but sees a hole on the ground where the bones are. He goes back to the wedding party and looks for Joe, who's dancing with the others. He tells him that he warned him to stay away from there. Joe doesn't understand at first, but he tells him that he didn't do anything. Joe notices the dirt on Peter's hands and asks him if he was looking for worms. Ronaldo laughs at this, and Peter gets mad at him for laughing. He pushes him, but they get separated before a fight breaks. Peter tells Steve he needs to show something to him and takes him to the hole, but there's nothing when they go there. He tells them about the skeleton, and Steve asks him if it might be a dog's bones. Peter disagrees and says he knows what a dog looks like. He tries to dig the ground, but they stop him saying they are drunk and it's muddy. They will dig it when they are sober and vow not to speak a word about it, especially to Zoe since she loved the place so much. Peter turns back to the wedding party, and Steve calls Joe to ask if he knows anything about the bones. Joe tells him he doesn't know anything. We see Zoe dancing and calling Peter next to her, and the professor looking at them. Peter gets up and goes to home again to throw up. He sees the doctor, and they talk about Zoe's grandfather. The doctor tells him that he's not the one who built the house, and he wasn't the saint everyone told him he is. Peter goes back to the wedding party, and Steve calls him to the stage to make a speech. While talking, he sees the dead woman in the backyard coming in and sitting at the table. He tells her name, Hannah, instead of Zoe, while saying he hopes to live many years with her. He notices and tries to joke about it, and they start dancing again. He tells Zoe he needs to tell her something, but they make them change partners before he can say it. Peter starts dancing with his mother-in-law, Zofia. She tries to talk to him, but he doesn't pay attention to her. She notices and asks if he's okay. They make them change partners again, and he starts to dance with an old lady. The woman tells him the bride is waiting. Peter looks at Zoe, but when he turns back to the old lady, he sees the dead woman instead. She tries to kiss him, and they continue to dance. Peter gets dressed and starts to sweat. He gets out of the dance floor and goes to sit next to a pastor. He tells him he wants to ask something, and the pastor listens to him. Peter asks if it's possible the spirit of a dead person can appear before them. The pastor asks if it's a loved one, and Peter says no, but he can't explain. The pastor tells him to speak in his own language, but Peter can't speak. He seems like he's choking and can't get the words out of his mouth. He tries and breaks the glass he holds, but he still can't say a single word. Then Steve comes, and the pastor says he needs to leave, but he makes him sit down again. Steve takes Peter to drink and talk with him to get to know him better. Peter asks him if he knows anything more about the skeleton. Steve tells him Peter saw it, but he didn't, so it may not even be true. Then, we see Zoe throwing her veil. They bring Peter in with his eyes closed, and he throws his bow tie. While the others try to catch it, he falls to the ground and starts shaking and having a seizure. Zoe runs to him, and they take him to the house. The doctor says it's epilepsy, and sends the ambulance back, saying he can handle it with sedative. They ask Zoe if he has epilepsy, and she says she had never seen him having attacks like that. The others return to the wedding party, and Zoe leaves saying she will be back, leaving the doctor alone with Peter. Zoe asks his brothers if they had given anything to Peter, but they say they have nothing to do with it. Joe leaves, and she keeps asking Ronaldo. He takes her to the backyard, where Peter said the bones are. She asks why they didn't tell her and leaves. She goes to the house, starts to look around, but she doesn't see Peter or the doctor there. She goes to the wedding party and sees them in there. Peter comes out of the crowd and collapses again. They get him up, but he starts to act strange. He starts twisting his hands, arms, neck and back. He falls on the ground again, and they get him up. He starts acting more strange and starts muttering. He takes off his shirt and yells while looking at the people around him. They hold his arms and carry him to the house. They lay him down on the bed and give him sedatives. He starts to talk in another language. Joe comes in, and the pastor follows him. They start to argue, while Peter slowly gets up from the bed. They ask pastor to tell something about him, and he says the doctor said it is epilepsy. The doctor takes it back, saying he has never seen epilepsy like that. The pastor tries to find other medical explanations, but he can't succeed to do so. The doctor suggests might be exorcism the answer. We see the pastor praying next to Peter, while he continues to speak in another language. Peter slowly gets up and looks at the ones around him, the pastor, doctor, Joe and Ronaldo. Right then, we see the wind blowing strongly in the barn. All the guests get up and run around to find a shelter from the storm. We see Ronaldo hitting Peter's head to the door, and others try to stop him. The pastor continues to pray, while the others close all the doors and windows. Then, they start praying with the pastor. We see the dead woman walking in the backyard, looking at Peter's dead body lying in a hole. We see the others cover it with the loader, while she watches them. Then, we see Peter at the house, with his head and nose bleeding, and the wind calms down. All the guests come to the house to hide from the storm, and we see Zoe looking for Peter. The professor follows her. When she looks around in the house, she finds him in the cellar with his father, brothers, and the pastor. She asks for professor's help, and he starts speaking to Peter in Yiddish. The professor asks him who he is, and Peter says Hannah. The professor gets shocked and says he only knows one Hannah in there. He says everyone in the area was in love with her, and he was one of them, but she only loved one Polish guy, then disappeared without a trace. Hannah asks him who is he, and he answers by saying his name, Simon. He tells her where he lived and sings a song to her for her to recognize him. We see the bride's mom, Sophie, talking with the guests. They tell her that they heard a rumor, and they ask her if it's true that the groom was possessed by a Jewish demon. She laughs at them and tells that this is nonsense. Then, we see the professor asking her why she took over Peter. She responds, saying he is her lover. The professor tells her to look at Zoe, who has been crying and distraught. He tells Hannah that he is her husband, and she needs to let him go, but Hannah refuses. The professor tells her that she doesn't exist anymore, but she gets upset and calls her parents. He tells her that her family also doesn't exist, and she tries to call them by yelling to them. Steve comes in, and the professor tries to tell him about the Jewish tradition Dybbuk, but he doesn't listen or pay attention to him. He tells him the only way to cut the connection with the dead and the living is with an exorcism, but he disagrees with it. He tells everyone that they've talked with the pastor, and since Peter is not conscious, the wedding is annulled. He tries to explain it to Zoe, but she doesn't listen to him. She slaps him and gets out of the cellar. They go up, and the pastor says he needs to go. They ask the doctor if he can drive him home, and he agrees. They go to take Peter's car, but they see Zoe digging the place where Ronaldo told her the bones were. They get out and stand next to her with Steve and Joe. They all try to talk and stop her, but she doesn't listen to them. She tells them to leave her alone and continues to dig. Ronaldo comes out and tells them Peter is gone. He is not in the cellar. They all run to the house and start looking for him. They tell the guests to go to the barn. Since the weather is better, they can look for Peter. We see them in cars, looking for Peter all over the town. Then we see Ronaldo covering up the hole, while the others are looking for Peter. They look at the streets and fields. We see the doctor lost, looking for Peter while trying to talk to Hannah. Then, we see everyone back at the farm. They all look tired and upset. Steve gets himself a bottle of vodka, gets on the stage, and tells everyone to go home and rest. He tells everyone that all they need is sleep, and they will be better once they do sleep. Everything will be clear when they wake up the next morning. There wasn't a groom and there wasn't a wedding. They just need to forget what they saw, because what they saw was a collective hallucination. We see Zoe sitting by herself in the barn. We see all the guests climbing up a hill. There is a hearse and people in black behind it. We see the woman in black, who was at the shore, and the one who made eye contact with Peter when they were going home after the church. They go past each other. Ronaldo goes to the mines with Peter's car and throw the car off a cliff. They take down the old house, and we see a wedding picture of Peter and Hannah. Zoe, who has just endured a tragedy, leaves in a small ferry boat.